Or not.
Or not.
Stay close when I stand.
Too high.
Okay, welcome to Sabbath School this morning. Michael Scofield is going to do our talk today, and he's talking to us about how Adventism has changed since World War II.
I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. This particular material I developed about 3 years ago. Sometimes it's hard to describe our culture and our environment when we're used to it, and that's why international travel is useful, because you see the way other people live, and then you can kind of reflect on what you're living in. Adventism has changed, but generally it's changed slowly. It's like boiling a frog. Sometimes we're not sensitive to that. So I'm going to try to inventory the change that has taken place. You've seen my genealogy, which demonstrated that I was a sixth-generation Adventist, but someone pointed out to me, in fact, Larry Garrity pointed out to me that my grandfather's ministerial certificate has the signature of W.H. Branson on it, and then the signature of the Atlantic Union Conference president, someone we don't remember very well, and then the Massachusetts Conference president back then. But what really interested me was this is a pre-printed form, and the word brother. It just didn't occur to them that anyone but a brother would be a minister. So that's in their world. Some familiar expressions that we don't use much anymore: revival, camp meeting. Well, we do, but they're not in this zip code. This is a unique zip code, and it's kind of hard to explain to the people back home. End times, pillars of the faith. Many Adventists still worry about being eternally lost. Mission emphasis is something that's fading away. I'll discuss that metrically later. Reaching the world, prophecy countdown. Do you remember that? Lay activities. And he's in the work. Laborers in the work. My grandfather held an effort at evangelistic meeting. Friday afternoon is the preparation day. Go to Trader Joe's and see all the Adventists. If time should last, we don't end our sentences that way anymore. The world must be warned. Didn't Sister White say that? And you can fill in the sentence. Or I seem to remember Sister White is quoted a lot without a lot of confidence. It's kind of, and we consult the spirit of prophecy, hold the standards high. Youth Congress, do we still have that? And the quarterly service. What is the quarterly service? Communion, yes. And call porters. They still come to my door from time to time. So I'm first going to look at some memories of what Adventism was like in the past. I'm going to discuss how the world has changed around Adventism, because it's part of our context. Spend just a little time in Adventist theology, a little time in polity, more time in institutions, and the big one is culture, how Adventist culture has changed, and then a little bit about what has not changed in Adventism. You remember this model from January, where we have I divided the church experience into ideas, institution, and culture, and I'll talk about changes in ideas in section 2, and policy and polity in section 3, and the institutions in section 4, and then we'll have fun with the culture. The culture, of course, is all kinds of things that we take for granted: our language, our behavior, our dress, our diet, our rituals, our scripts, the way we behave, the way we dress. And it's all also part of our self-identity. So at the end of World War II, you had the American culture and you had the Adventist culture, and you could contrast them, and we felt pretty isolated back then. As we move forward in time, the difference between the American culture and the Adventist culture is less distinct. Some may decry that. I'm not particularly. So I'm talking about North America only, and I'm not a professionally trained historian. I have no credentials in sociology. I simply observe and write. Camp meeting was part of our heritage. The tents out in the field, generally in summer. The poster with the images of the beast and the last day events, that's part of our heritage. This was Linwood Camp Meeting when I was a child. We drove down Atlantic Boulevard to get to the Linwood Camp Meeting. This was the kindergarten tent where I started my camp meeting experience. That's all gone now. This is someone's ideal vision of a children's Sabbath school. It's obviously posed, okay? It appeared in this textbook for academy students about the church. Here's another similar kind of photo, obviously posed. No one would sit that close to other people. La Sierra College. Look at the length of the skirts on the women.
You're there in that picture.
You were there?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
My colleague roommate there on the far right.
He
Oh,
became the pharmacist for the hospital.
you recognize that?
Yes.
Oh, my, okay.
Wow.
I hope it was a happy experience. Okay. Youth Congress.
It wasn't posed.
No, that photo was not posed. A keynote of outpost evangelism was sounded at the Pan American Youth Congress. I suspect that's the San Francisco Civic Auditorium. We had two images of the coming of the Christ, the second coming. One was very joyful, and one was very anxiety-producing. Okay? Are you ready for Jesus to come? A year ago, we talked about the lyrics and the embedded theology in the lyrics, and are you ready for persecution? This is a very common image. And then the Revelation seminars with the beasts and everything to scare small children at night. This is the class of 1903 in Hillsburg College. And I want you to look at those faces. Many of these young people were told, no use getting married, Christ is coming soon. It's a waste of time to get an education. Every last one of those people has died, and Christ has not come yet. Okay? This is a Christian salesmanship class from 1927 at Southern Missionary College. These are the trustees of Pacific Union College. I forget the year, but it's a bunch of old white guys. But people we know, Norval Pease, Richard Hamill, but it's predominantly male. At Southern, they pass out this little card for you to do your spiritual self-evaluation of a lot of those come out of the Beatitudes, I see. But and if you didn't measure up, there was some anxiety about being saved. So back in January, I talked about the 4 ages of Adventism, how it's changed on the wide scale, starting with primitive and institutional and congregational and information age. And I would peg the start of congregational Adventism at the end of World War II. So what has changed in the world, in the U.S., in the economy, and how do they influence Adventism? Well, lots has changed. There's more tolerance for minority faiths and religion in America, except for Islam right now. So for Adventists, persecution seems less likely. I grew up worrying about persecution. No more. And legal enforcement of accommodations for Sabbath keeping is something that didn't happen until after World War II. I can tell, I was in the Army, and If we said we were Adventists, we had rights and we had Sabbath off. It was policy. That was not the folk stories that I heard from people earlier on, particularly in World War II. There is an increase in personal wealth in America, so Adventists have higher expectations for their church and their church facilities. The general population is more health conscious lately, so being a vegetarian is no longer weird. And that's somewhat comforting. There's more mobility and lower cost of travel, so we have more choices in what congregation we attend and more choices in what schools we attend. There's more equality for women in employment and compensation, so we're starting to see more, in Adventism, more women in leadership positions, particularly in education. There's longer retail hours now, so we have easier access to commercial and retail activities in non-Sabbath hours. There are more channels of communication available, particularly in the last 10 years. So for institutional Adventism, it's much harder to attract an audience for the core message of Adventism. We have more guaranteed employee rights. Institutional Adventism has slowly moved to recognize those employee rights. Yet, employment is less secure. Being a worker is no longer the sole definition of your career like it was when Walton Brown explained it to me in 1973 at the General Conference. Church employment is no longer guaranteed. There's a general trend towards casual dress in all aspects of life and commerce. I remember the first time I flew to speak at a professional conference and I had not packed a necktie. I felt very nervous, but we survived. So church apparel is more liberal in many congregations, and the difference in appearance causes stress for some traditionalists. So the environment of Adventism in the U.S., we have tougher job requirements. A bachelor's degree in the liberal arts no longer is a guarantee of finding a job. The U.S. population is better educated or perhaps better trained, but not necessarily smarter. The divorce rate has declined. There's all kinds of metrics that seem to be improving. The teen birth rate has declined. Our air and water is cleaner. There's more restrictions on tobacco usage. That's a good thing. Makes us feel more comfortable. You remember this ad? More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. I love the copy on that. This is out of the 50s. So we have declining in abortion rates, rape rate, a lot of good trends. Yet a larger population of the citizens of America are in prison. In our technology and everyday life, there's expectation of instant availability, shorter attention spans. Teachers understand this, particularly. The students are more lazy. Will this be on the final? Yet society has a digital memory it's harder to be forgotten. There's more use of recreational drugs. Drug use is extolled in song, film, and culture. The sexual revolution has been followed by an AIDS scare, but there's still much looser behavior there. And I'm trying to be non-judgmental on what I'm presenting today, but some of this, my bias will come through. In media, there's trivialization of death, violence, and sex, and I think that is a bad thing for society. What more? The decline in the mainstream Protestant churches, that was described in your reading assignment last night. The rise of evangelical churches, the religious right demanding more influence. So, some metrics. More women in the workplace, which places more stress on family life. Declining labor union influence. Labor unions were an anathema when I went to college. We were told how bad they would be, but they are They have a declining influence because the U.S. is moving from a manufacturing economy to a service economy and more distributed corporately. The NAD membership per population, the number of Adventists per 1,000 people, has risen since 1925. Now 3 out of 1,000 people would be active or at least book members of the Adventist Church. But the North American division, particularly the United States, as a share of world membership has declined, mainly because world membership has grown faster. The NAD share of tithe donated to the church, we're no longer the cash cow. That has declined significantly in recent years, and again, that's because of the growth of Adventism elsewhere, outside of North America. One thing that I tracked with great interest back in 1976-75 was mission offerings donated by members in North America. But what was also going on was they were donating more to local. So if we normalize this by looking at these two offerings, mission and local, and mission offerings is a measure of altruism to a certain extent. Since 1945, there is a significant shift in the priorities of what people give to. Part of it is because mission offerings tend to be out of sight, mission needs tend to be out of sight, and the offerings tend to be ritual, whereas offerings for local church building, local schools, there's more immediate visibility for the demand, for the need, and so that the donations for those things took off through the 1950s and 1960s. If we assume that tithe paying is a constant ethic, and hence tithe is a measure of personal income in the United States, we see that the membership in North America is getting poorer, and there's all kinds of evidence of that. I've gotten pushback on that, but I think tithe is a pretty reliable measure of personal income in Adventism. So there's been a shift from white upper middle class membership to much more rapid growth in the low income minorities, the Hispanic and the black communities. So that has changed how conferences spend money. I remember Southern California Conference had 2 ministers for every congregation back in the 60s, and now some congregations are going into a district because they don't have enough money to pay ministers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in talking about changes in doctrine because Rick Rice has this topic in his hip pocket. He's very good at this. But I see in Adventism a diversification of doctrine and belief. There's a waning urgency about the second coming. There's more recognition of justification by faith, which I think is a positive. The use of authoritative sources is kind of confused. The attitude towards science and education, there's tension there. We love science when it gives us anesthesia, but earth sciences we're less comfortable with. So attitudes towards Sabbath keeping, and I'll talk about that more in the cultural part, are sometimes liberalizing. And more or less, we see Adventism as a world church. But there's, as I discussed a year ago, this grassroots theology in Adventism, which is very problematic and sometimes hurtful. So in my view, the doctrines and the collective thought of Adventism has diversified over time. If we could linearize it, we'd have this bell curve. And so there are more people on the liberal side or the progressive side, and there are more people on the orthodox side. And how do they ever talk to each other? That is a challenge. In polity, The treatment of employees is a big issue. Adventism has not a good record in how it treated its employees in the past. I can tell anecdotes of employee records being destroyed so the conference president wouldn't have to pay retirement benefits. The treatment of women has improved, but we have a long way to go. Divorce is no longer a career killer in the ministry or in education, at least in Southern California. There's more lay participation in governance of the church, so less clergy control over institutions, at least as managing the institutions. In 1930, any minister was considered capable of running a sanitarium. That's no longer true. And in the ministry, I see a shift from generalization to specialization. So having a bachelor's degree in theology does not make you a good marriage counselor necessarily. And there are other denomination practices, and mission service has taken on a very different quality in recent years. We talked about this back in January. The 19-year lag between the equal pay legislation signed by John F. Kennedy and the church finally coming around to providing equal pay for women for comparable jobs. It took 19 years for the church to come around to that. Adventist institutions are in some challenges. K through 12 education is struggling. Higher education is precarious financially. A year ago, this is April, right? A year ago, we talked about that. And both academies and colleges have a declining percentage of their student body that are Adventists. Some people are concerned about that. Healthcare is becoming big and bureaucratic, and the market, the reimbursement mechanisms for healthcare is incredibly complex. And publishing communications is slowly becoming deinstitutionalized, and that, of course, is being fragmented. We'll look at that. Growth and success of anything that the church does is not necessarily guaranteed, in spite of feelings of triumphalism. Elementary enrollment is declining in church schools if we normalize it by the number of members, and this is true for all the union conferences across the country. NAD academies peaked out at 20,000 enrollment in 1980, and then they have declined since then. A lot of boarding academies have closed, and that is a complex problem, but the academies are a feeder system for the colleges, so this is one source of anxiety for college administrators. Yet some academies survive by actively recruiting non-Adventist students, and in the Pacific Union, 22% of academy students do not come from an Adventist household. Now, how do you define Adventism or Adventist household is a little slippery. I found this chart. This came from the General Conference statistical report, that the percentage of graduates that are denominationally employed, and how do you measure that when you have to keep in touch with a graduate to know where they're working, and that's a challenge that colleges are going to have to pursue pretty soon. We used the existence of the education system, the college system, was to train workers for the cause. Do you remember that expression? And now a much smaller percentage of graduates from Adventist colleges go into the work. The enrollment per 1,000 members has declined again since 1970. Lots of reasons for that, and that's a whole hour topic that I don't want to go into today. Running a hospital is not for amateurs. Healthcare in America as a share of personal consumption expenditures has gone from 3% up to 16% of the economy goes into healthcare. Part of that is we live longer, we have more needs all kinds of, that's another hour-long topic. But the sanitarium model is obsolete. Economics stress is hitting small hospitals. When I drive up to Bishop, I wonder, will there be an emergency room there if I need it? So hospitals have to have economies of scale, and not just in purchasing. And running hospitals is not for amateurs anymore. So we have the professionalization of hospital management with appropriate compensation, which annoys a lot of ministers. Loma Linda Medical Center, this is a couple years ago, had total revenue of $1.2 billion. So it's a big operation. Executive compensation is a big deal, a big concern of some of the people who are not so well compensated. Talk about publishing communication, which was a big part of Adventist's process of Adventist self-identity. Adventism has as central to its mission and identity the desire to communicate ideas, the gospel, whatever that may include. The church will use whatever modes of communication that are available. And so the best communication to my mind, to encourage a person to become a Christian continues to be dialogue, correspondence, preaching, publishing, broadcasting, and we are embracing broadcasting sometimes without adequate metrics of what the money is accomplishing. So all this is process oriented, and in the past 10 years we're starting to think about metrics, particularly in higher education. But we ought to be thinking about metrics in other things we do. So at APC, when all the different ministries set up their booths up here on the 4th floor, the devil in me wants to ask them to go up to these people in the ministries, the various ministries, and say, "How are you different from the ministry down the road? Or how is your market different? How is your message different? How is your genre different?" But that's unfair, because these aren't the people in the booths. These aren't the people who are really making the decisions about the ministry in the long run. So, in society, in the world economy, we have more channels of communication, more advertising noise, more competition for audience and consumer attention, or eyeballs, as they sometimes say. So it's more difficult to get the attention of any audience if you are trying to evangelize over mass media. So within Adventist media, there are two audiences, and there's a conflict between these two audiences. And we were talking about this with my friends at the Voice of Prophecy back in 1974, 75. But there are lower barriers to entry to becoming, putting your church on TV or streaming video or things like that, which is enabling a lot of mediocrity, in my view. Technology and prowess in being very clever at technology doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the medium and the audience, and I've seen that repeatedly. And then there's the issue of aesthetics and culturally segmented audience. So the two audiences, the audience external to Adventism, who we want to persuade that Christianity is important and our kind of Christianity is important and they should participate in. And then there's the audience internal to Adventism, devotional, material, institutional image, and member self-esteem. So sometimes the broadcast ministries have to cater to their donors from within Adventism. And those donors may not understand the nature of the market outside of Adventism. So, and also our internally directed communication, we certainly want to encourage patronage of the education system. So both experience and both of these experience growing competition for eyeballs. So getting the attention of readers, getting the attention of viewers is more and more difficult. I remember, I think this was during the General Conference session, the Review publishes daily issues. And this thing came and there was just a hint of triumphalism here in this title, and then a picture of the General Conference president. And that just struck me as a bit, I guess triumphalistic is the best term. But how we reach people, how people are aware of the world and aware of ideas has changed over time. So we had newspapers up until 1920. Then we had magazines. Time magazine was launched in 1923. Then there was radio and television after World War II, and over-the-air networks, of course. And then the explosion of cable. And cable enabled far more channels to specialize. And then in the last 20 years, we've had web delivery of content, which has just exploded the number of options and, of course, the difficulty of attracting an audience. So there's an exponential increase in the volume of content. And personally, I do not have a working television anymore. If I want to watch television, I have to check into a hotel, which I spent the week in Atlanta, so I was watching a lot of Big Bang Theory. But so we went from reading newspapers and magazines and books, I'm talking about society at large, to watching and listening to radio, the car, and television, and our attention is fragmented. We're shorter stories, images without stories. So I see in students a shorter attention span and less integrated learning, and that is a challenge. When I was a kid, I was in first grade, came home from school one day, and my parents had bought a TV, an antenna on the roof, and the first show I saw was Howdy Doody. Okay, in the Los Angeles media market, there were just 7 channels, the 3 basic networks and 4 independent channels. Okay, well, I've tried to do a taxonomy of the cable and satellite TV channels that are available now, and the taxonomy has to go on several dimensions. It's really like taking a drink out of a fire hose. These are just the news sources that are available on cable or streaming video today. Yes, and some of them are truthful. So when the bottom line with publishing and communication is that the genres have changed and the audience has changed. There's, I would call it micro-fragmentation, shorter attention span, less available time to pay attention, to sit down and watch a show, and the types of media have changed, both the opportunities and the expectations. And this has enormous consequence for how we communicate to the world, and therefore metrics are far more important to help us allocate our resources wisely. Culture, my favorite part. Culture, of course, involves language, ethnicity, music, lifestyle, apparel in the church, art and architecture, our God talk, our worldview, theology, and how we see the world. I talked a little bit a year ago about divine temporal activism. That's worth a full hour, because that is really important, how we see God working in the world and how we make decisions both individually and collectively. And our horizon of awareness. I think Adventists are less culturally isolated than we were. So if I were to describe Adventism, I'd say, well, we're part of the American population, we're part of the Christian culture, and we're part of the Protestant culture, And so we're deep inside, and these are all part of the context of our Adventist experience. And within the Adventist culture, we have church members who are on the books and lots of former members, and those are interesting people. Among the active members and the inactive members still on the books, I think Loma Linda University Church has 6,000 members, and maybe 3,000 are active, and the rest are just on the books. Of the active members, you have the mainstream Orthodox in the middle, and you have the very conservative, like the people downstairs, and then you have the progressives, like a lot of the people in this room. And the workers, the people working at the medical center in the university, are distributed over this entire, they are drawn from all these groups. So it's kind of a hodgepodge. Okay, we have shifting demographics in the North American church. There's a loss of urgency and sacrifice. There's cultural isolation, wrestling with self-esteem. I remember not wanting people to know I was Adventist when I stood on the corner waiting for the school bus or things like that. Isolation yields rituals, lexicons, scripts, and customs which further isolate us. And there is a microeconomy in Adventism. We drove 20 miles from my academy down to Downey to take piano lessons from an Adventist teacher. And we drove past a lot of other perfectly good music teachers because we wanted to do it with an Adventist, actually a friend. I think, this is my estimation, there's no data behind this curve, but I think the Adventist population is distributed between those thinking that Christ is coming very soon and interpreting every event in the world news as another indication of that. And at the other end, people who say, well, it's not going to be for a while. And that affects how we make institutional decisions. We are in a building that is designed to last. It's rugged, it's solid, it's going to be around here for 100 years if time should last. The enthusiasm for detailed Bible study that I see around is, there are a few people who love to find obscure things in Scripture and want to tell me about it, and if I see them in the cafeteria, I kind of look away. Whereas most of the Adventists I know are not really enthusiastic about digging into Scripture, wrestling with theology, but I do know some people like that. So I think the skew is more towards just accepting our heritage doctrines. In congregational school practice, there's more tolerance of intramural sports. La Sierra has a big band, does big band concerts. That would never happen in the 1950s. And they're very good. They're very good. Fiction assigned by English teachers, gasp. Food in children's Sabbath school divisions, I'll say more about that. Workers can wear wedding bands now. There's waning enthusiasm for evangelistic meetings, and we tolerate mixed bathing. We have guitars in church, and I see a lot of congregational mobility. Back in the 50s, first of all, the summer camp was gender isolated. The girls came one week and the boys came another week. And they were told to bring dresses to wear for Sabbath services out. And I don't see much leg in any of these apparel. Okay. We tolerate weddings with non-believers. We're less formal church discipline of members. We're loath to disfellowship people. Whereas we did it with glee back in the 30s. Less study of the Sabbath school lesson, less attendance of traditional Sabbath school. We now do funerals on Sabbath. We never did that in the 40s and the 50s. In some large congregations, they actually pay people to lead cradle roll. Dorcas, what's that? And of course, there's more television generated by local congregations. And this concerns me, less reverence in the sanctuary. After church, a lot of chatter, and some of it loud. That's not the way I was raised. I don't know, do you sense that? More applause in church services, I agonize over that. Public prayer can be more extemporaneous and more precarious when they do. We can't count on anyone being at church every Sabbath because we're more mobile. We will be gone on a weekend. Now, as part of it is the crowd that I associate with do things beyond their individual church, so they could be gone on weekends. Last Sabbath I was in Collegedale. That was an experience. Willingness to bring lawsuits. Let's see. Fewer strict vegetarians, more use of coffee. Oh, I'm not going to go there. Willingness to travel or even fly on Sabbath. I remember the first commercial flight I took on Sabbath. It's very traumatic. I'm putting everyone in this plane in danger.
Get closer to the main office, though.
Yeah. We never did restaurant meals on Sabbath when I grew up. We're much more comfortable going to the cinema. I used to drive to Santa Monica from where I lived in Glendale, so no one would see me going into the theater. Am I a special case? Am I clinically interesting? We send our children to non-Adventist schools without guilt. We're more exposed to secular publications. And we're not deathly afraid anymore of our children dating or marrying non-believers. That's a big step. And I think that reflects a change in understanding of the nature of salvation and the availability of salvation. Because in the 50s, if you left Adventism, you lost salvation. Did you ever learn that? Did that ring a bell? That's big, because I have friends, and I don't see them here, who are agonizing over their children marrying non-believers. That's an expression, non-believer, right there. See, I'm immersed in this. If time should last. We're going to the lake next weekend, if time should last. Decline in family worship. Natina. That's part of our identity. I genuinely like cold Natina. But what has emerged is you can't do cradle roll without Pepperidge Farm goldfish, right? In fact, you can't do cradle roll without food now. So, and there are emotional triggers for our cultural diversity. There are gaps, generational gaps, that I think are more severe now. And so we got to ask, what in our services, what in our culture, what in our rituals make people more uncomfortable, or what bores them? Just take music, for example. I'm way over on the right end of this continuum, and there's praise music and guitar and drums over on the other end. Some people will describe the guitar end as music of the devil, and the young people will describe my music as boring and irrelevant. So we have a conundrum. How do we react to apparel and appearances in church? So how do we find common ground between the old and the young? And what expressions of faith, be it singing, be it art, can all engage in together enthusiastically? I think this is a critical question for the church in general, as well as for congregations. What expression and experience can we bond together on? Music, art, drama, because worship is so cultural that we have the potential of alienating somebody if by any kind of cultural expression. So is there any music, individual or work or style of music, which can bridge the generational gap? That's a 1 hour topic at least. And how do we define sacred music? That's another hour-long topic. So, what makes people comfortable and uncomfortable? There are a lot of Adventists that don't want a woman in the pulpit or even on the platform. And the young people hanging out makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And of course, the Sabbath-keeping behavior and what we eat. What has not changed? I'll go through this real quickly. The use of authoritative writings, literalism, the need for security and self-esteem among Adventists. Since we're outside of the cultural mainstream, we need to be told we're good, we're still okay. Most members still don't understand salvation by grace, so they're judgmental and legalistic. We've talked about this before. And there's still some paranoia about eschatology. I told you about the church in Boston that my mother and I attended one New Year's Sabbath. And the minister got up and said, "This may be the year that they take away our children for keeping the Sabbath." Kind of a paranoia there. There's still a focus on process rather than outcomes for denominational activities, and a reluctance to measure the outcomes. I'll skip over this. Yeah, this caught my attention 15 or more years ago. I was kind of surveying Adventist websites back then, and there was you set up an Adventist business website, and you do business with a customer through a payment and a service interaction that part of which is facilitated over the web. There was a company advertising to Adventists that would put up a Sabbath firewall that would prevent transactions from taking place during Sabbath hours. So you could keep your website up and running, but the Sabbath firewall. And I kind of wondered, Sabbath where? Okay. So it would turn off those or prevent those transactions. I haven't seen that recently. So the problem is Adventism and our polity institutions have changed radically since World War II. But the administrative paradigm in Silver Spring has not changed that much. And now we're seeing pressure to revert to primitive Adventism, which is alienating an entire generation of young people, and a yearning for purity. And young people in modern culture are leaving the church. So cultural diversity makes community more difficult. It makes worship more difficult. So what do we have in common? So some possible solutions is administrators should go on listening tours rather than preaching on Sabbath morning. Or ordained administrators by policy should complete their careers in a parish setting and live with the policies they enacted. But I could be wrong. Ron.
You left out the mother's room. When I was a child, if a child misbehaved, there was no mother's room. If a child misbehaved, they were taken out and subjected to an aversive experience. Brought back in, and they would be a worse aversive experience if they misbehaved again. So we had better behavior in church.
Yes, with using draconian methods to enforce it. What else did I leave out? Yes?
The right hand of the message.
Health. Okay.
My brother, well, yes.
I forgot that expression, yes.
My brother was an attorney. He called himself the left hand.
Never heard that before. Doug.
Yeah, on your common expressions, right hand is the message. Another one I missed was present truth.
Present truth.
I wonder if that's one we need right now.
And we all have different interpretations of what present truth is. Yes. Graham.
Good stuff, Mike. While things definitely change, and a bunch of old people like us can remember a long time ago, And it always is a bit jarring. I wonder, well, I think, I mean, the conversations I've had with you, I know you acknowledge this, that if you control for a lot of the factors that have happened in culture anyway, you know, I mean, Methodist schools 100 years ago were pretty much like Avondale College, you know, Adventist colleges, Avondale College. So that sort of shift is not unique to us. But I think the challenges that you pointed out, I think, are real. But what it shows too, the fact that we have changed and we continue to change, even kicking and screaming, I think sometimes, shows that there is a fight on to stay relevant.
Yes.
You know?
So would you say that the changes in Adventism under pressure from society is inevitable to a great extent? I mean, we haven't pushed back like the Amish or Mennonites have.
Well, if you're an amateur sociologist, I'm a small A amateur sociologist. So I'd say there's a certain amount of inevitability, which is good. How much of it? How many of us would like to live with Christianity as first century Christianity? It wouldn't say anything to anybody.
Right.
How many of us would like to live as Christians 300 years ago? It wouldn't say anything to anybody.
So you see the...
So while there's this tension and discomfort, and you do hear it, I think, a lot now about this this desire to return to some idealistic time in America when everybody had 2.3 children and a white picket fence around their house. We tend to forget the institutional racism and all of that sort of stuff that went on. So what we've got to do is collectively take courage, hold each other's hands if we can, and say, what's the new, the next 50 years going to bring us, etc. Move on. One of the things I love what you emphasise is that while I'm really happy to be called a Seventh-day Adventist, you do wonder how long that name will be relevant. And I'm not saying we ought to change it, but the idea of an imminent second coming does drive a lot of decision making, as you pointed out. A lot of it good, but some of it bad.
What I also heard you say is that the fact that we have changed shows a positive flexibility in responding to cultural change.
Yeah, I think you can read some of those changes in that way. Oh.
Yeah.
Cultural change in general, the power of theater, it's immense and it's captivating, it's addictive. I mean, it's so, it's just become so much more effective because of the technology. A movie in the 1930s versus a movie now, is much more in your face, so to speak. I think
Are you talking theater? You're also talking about television and cinema.
Well, I'm thinking more of a big screen and a movie, which then you bring and you buy a big TV at home and watch. That is very powerful. I don't think we're acknowledging or realizing the effect of that for society. We're all just so media oriented now to get
And I worry about children being exposed to some of the cinema that I see. Yeah, Forrest.
I think one of the things that I've seen drastically change, and that is the recognition that the church is big business. And that means we have to be more careful in our policies. We have to be more careful in our budgeting. We have seen Atlantic Community College go down. We saw Pioneer Valley Academy go down. We are open to lawsuits at any time. And I might mention that Adventist Health, one of the Adventist Health entities, just got socked with $180 million fine. So all these smart guys that have gone into healthcare really haven't done us a lot of favor.
I would disagree. I still argue for the professionalism
I'm not
of
arguing
management.
professional.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
just saying is, I think.
It's still a precarious economic
$180 million bucks.
environment, yes. Yeah. Donna? You're not? Okay.
I didn't raise my hand.
Okay.
Did I?
Sure.
I have a comment.
It's kind of a little off topic, but if you compare, you're talking about Adventism to where the American nation state is at the moment. I can't remember times when almost every American institution governing has less credibility than right now.
Yep.
And America's soft power, the cultural power, appears to me to be at an ebb, except for maybe the cinema and theater as she was talking about. But everything else seems to be at a nadir of credibility and believability. And I wonder if that sort of opens some ability for the church to have a positive.
So the church has potential for being more of a moral voice
Right.
in this situation.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not quite happy with the way you use terms conservative and progressive.
Okay.
Or liberal on the other side.
That is so one-dimensional. I know.
Yeah, well, the reason why that bothers me is because I've had trouble with both groups, and each one always looks for a way to couch themselves on some moral high ground.
Mm-hmm.
And they will use terminology for that purpose. So I have used value-neutral, how should I say, descriptors. I call them the right-wingers and the left-wingers.
That's value neutral.
Well, to me,
Okay.
because I'm looking at the pilgrim's path, and there is a ditch on either side, not much traveling there.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with these is that you've got these groups, each one of which vies to carve out ever bigger chunk of the middle
Yeah.
for their own territory.
Part of the problem is in describing any ideological polarization is it's multidimensional. It's not single dimension. So I am a religious conservative in some respects, and I personally am a progressive in other respects. So I'm torn in both directions, and I think some other people here are also. We need more adjectives. We need good adjectives to describe that. That's why I've been starting to use the word orthodox, or chain the adjectives together. Like I said, mainstream orthodox is in the middle, and then a more orthodox is the conservative end. It's much more complex than I had time to describe here, obviously. Yes, on the back row.
Well, I was just curious if, when you're talking about these changes that have occurred, if there were periods of time when there was a great change. So when I look at some of your slides and the statistics, it looked like in the 80s there was a great downfall. And then, but yet in the 60s, when society, maybe it's the late 60s, was really changing, Adventism didn't go and change that much. It wasn't until the 80s, and there were issues in the 80s that caused a big down change, and then from there, maybe it stabilized, and now I see maybe with the web, I don't know if it's related to the internet or not, but there's now another big change occurring.
Yeah, I think the last 20 years bring a lot of new stresses to society, particularly the technology-induced stress, the greater choices of what we read and what we consume, and hence more decisions to make. And but I don't, other than the metrics that I showed you, I don't have metrics. Well, 1960, the birth rate started down, but that's because of the pill. But I don't have a lot of metrics that would show a really significant event that changed things. But Graham may.
Well, look, just one thing, I think. Theologically, the 80s were, and I know this might sound too much of a stretch for it to be the total answer, and it's not. But the 1980s was justification by faith time in the Adventist church. And the moment the saints started to say, I don't have to be that frightened or shamed, then things started to change. Is a hunch for me that was one of the, at least, the change agents.
Justification by faith, real grasping that, lowers an individual's stress.
Yes. And things
And that enables a lot of other creativity and...
It's certainly not the total answer,
but
but it's one of the factors.
But I just don't see that the totality of Adventism has embraced justification by faith.
I think the younger group has.
Pardon?
Don't you think the young,
The
younger?
younger
I mean,
probably,
my children's, they
They
don't.
don't
Yeah.
use that phrase.
Yeah, they don't use the phrase maybe, but it's totally that way.
And they're at peace with their eternal
Okay.
destiny. I hate using that word.
Well, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, it's time to conclude, so Laura will lead us in the benediction.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was very interesting.
Very good, Mark.
Let's read our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Have a good Sabbath.
You go through so much.